when Max Müller translated the Rig Veda in the 1860s, I think it was, he put 1500, and it was a pure guess. Now, later in his life, he admitted it was a pure guess. He didn't know. And I think his quote was something like, whether it's 1500 or 15,000, they stand alone and are very important. But other historians just didn't listen to that. They took the 1500 and cemented it as fact. And it's not fact. It was, as he admitted, it was a guess. We're talking here about the time of the Trojan War. I said the redating of Mediterranean Bronze Age. The Trojan War in conventional history is at 1188 or 1177 BC. So it was Indian merchants, and we've got plenty of archaeological evidence that it was Indian merchants in enclaves in Mesopotamia that were organizing this trade. They were shipping it in. They had merchants representation in Mesopotamia, and the big cultural influence, which you can see right up to near the Levant coast, the eastern Mediterranean. And it was only in the mid-19th century that evangelical Christianity seemed to pervade Victorian society.
Namaste, I Radhika Lele welcome you all on today's episode of Sangam Talks. I am delighted to welcome maritime historian Nick Collins. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to briefly introduce our today's speaker. So, Nick is a maritime expert, trade expert, 40 years of experience in London, Tokyo, Singapore, and Dubai. Nick formally pursued a degree in history from the University of Cambridge, and his expertise lies in global commerce of the past. He has two volumes to his credits, namely How Maritime Trade and Indian Subcontinent Shaped the World, and the second is The Millennium Maritime Revolution. Nick's work primarily focuses on maritime trade and how civilizations did not develop in isolation, but was a result of flourishing trade, the exchange of ideas, philosophies, and the culture. The research is drawn from archaeological sources, ancient texts, and personal practical experiences. Major highlight of Nick's research is his view of India as the cradle of ancient civilization and his presentations of new theories that change our outlook on ancient India and its lore. I once again welcome Nick Collins and look forward to having some amazing conversations.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sir, to begin with this interview, my first question is, you wrote a book titled How Maritime Trade and the Indian Subcontinent Shaped the World. Tell us that how important was the Indian subcontinent? Like how much bigger role it played in shaping the civilizations that it needs a special mention in the title of the book itself.
The original title was going to be An Untold World History, but the publishers, when they read it, they said, well, Indian subcontinent has got to be front and center of the book because that's what you talk about mostly. It's not only about the Indian subcontinent, but how it shaped the world is pretty well much of the book. So we have to go back to the Ice Age. And if you can picture most of Central Europe, the whole of Japan, central China, north of which is all under ice or permafrost, and very cold south of that. And so what you've got left in the world for the development of human civilization is the equatorial regions, which would have then been perhaps temperate or perhaps Mediterranean type climates. And the dominant feature is the Indian Ocean. And sticking out in the middle of the Indian Ocean is the subcontinent of India. And at that time, there would have also been a huge landmass we call Sunderland, where there is, after the flood, where there is now a large group of islands called Indonesia, and the coastline of India would have been gone out another 25 miles or so, and the coastline of China and Southeast Asia, probably a little bit further because because of their continental shelf. So, so this is absolutely pivotal for the habitation of the world. Now, what happened is after the last glacial maximum, the Earth warmed. So not only did sea levels rise in gradually, but also in a series of floods, three floods. And they've been dated to somewhere around 12,500 BC, 9,500 BC, and the last one, the biblical flood, 5,600 BC, approximately. But not only did these sea levels rise, but the Himalayas melted. Not the Himalayas melted, but the ice caps and the glaciers on the Himalayas melted. And it caused a huge, fantastic drainage system in northwest India. And the famous seven rivers, probably a lot more, and tributaries, and canals were constructed from them. And this was a huge economic powerhouse where perhaps 10% of the population of the world lived, perhaps more. But, you know, it's an approximation. It's hugely important. And like all maritime civilizations, which I have documented in these books, when a civilization is fully maritime orientated, it is an inventive civilization. It has to look at boat building, the ingress of water, the sail design, oar design, and so much more. And then the merchants have to understand foreign appetites for their goods and what they can bring back. So they're strongly inventive and culturally rich civilization. And there is nowhere else like it on the earth at this time. The one exception, perhaps, is southern India, the Tamil lands. Now I think you've got a question for me later, but if I can just come to this earlier, we've known that the Tamil lands have been hugely important for maritime trade into the distant past, just like northwest India. But actually, in the last couple of years, work has been published on not excavations, but sonar readings of the ancient port of Pumphahar, 25 kilometers out to sea from the present port, where they have sonar read the ancient port, which covered a huge area, you know, a number of square miles, with various settlements interconnected by canals, including the port itself, a harbour, which they say could accommodate 60 to 80 ships at a time, and a structure which they even claim could be a lighthouse, which would be astonishing given that their dates for it are 15,000 BC. In other words, in the Ice Age. So whether I don't know how they arrived at 15,000 BC. Maybe that was the I don't know. I've tried to find out what method they used, but I haven't succeeded. But even if it's 10,000 or 11,000, like the offshore port they found in the Gulf of Cambay, it's still astonishing. So the Indian subcontinent as a whole, but especially from what we know, northwest India, but possibly also South India, were unrivaled cultural and economic powerhouses at this early stage of the world history.
So, sir, as you were talking, you mentioned about Indian Ocean and its flourishing fertile river system. So, did India's geography had a big role in making it a civilization engine? I'm sure the coastlines on both the sides has helped ancient India set up the maritime world trade system.
The fact that it's got two massive, long coastlines jutting in right into the center of the Indian Ocean is absolutely crucial for the trade. Yes.
Sir, how flourishing was the trade between ancient Mesopotamian civilization and the Indus-Saraswati civilization?
Well, I think it was again crucial. Um, what we've got is in the fourth millennium BC, you've got Mesopotamia, which was like the Sahara, a kind of savanna type uh, area, and like the Sahara, was drying, and so it was concentrated on the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and what's happening here is that they've got civilization, and some people call it the cradle of civilization, but it's got an economy which now I researched the economy of ancient Mesopotamia, and according to all the experts that have spent lifetimes at this, what we've got is a lot of sheep farming, on which millions of sheep, on which they have a flourishing woolen textile industry. And I haven't been able to find out much that they've got other stuff going on. So what is the basis for this civilization? Well, there is plenty of evidence that their merchants were selling this woolen cloth up in northern Mesopotamia and in Anatolia, in other words, modern day Turkey, which was and is metal rich. You've got lead, you've got silver, you've got copper, and you've got a little bit of gold, not much. In my opinion, with the archaeological discoveries they've discovered on the western side of the Persian Gulf, stops for the ships trading, and then in Oman, with using the monsoon winds to northwest India, a trade exchanging foodstuffs from India, timber, because the Mesopotamia was timber deficient. India is very fortunate; it has plenty of timber. But the usual pearls and diamonds, and but pepper and other drugs and spices. So, what could Mesopotamia give to India, which they wanted? And my suggestion is the metals, in particular the precious metals that they were getting from Anatolia, and because there wasn't much else, and it was in Indian ships because Mesopotamia is timber deficient. They did construct boats of reed, which some historians and have Thor Heyerdahl famously sailed a reed boat out of the Persian Gulf, but I don't think that's sustainable for. So it was Indian merchants, and we've got plenty of archaeological evidence that it was Indian merchants in enclaves in Mesopotamia that were organizing this trade. They were shipping it in. They had merchants representation in Mesopotamia, and the big cultural influence which you can see right up to near the Levant coast, the eastern Mediterranean. So that's I think how it was organized.
Then you have also claimed in your research that the trade with Saraswati region may have indirectly been the reason for Uruk's invasion of Egypt, establishing its first pharaonic dynasty to access gold, ancient India's so-called currency of choice. So can you brief our viewers about it?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I've just got to say that it's not the established view that Uruk invaded Egypt to cause the first pharaohs. It's been a political and fashionable football. I'll just give you a brief explanation of why this has been. In the 1890s, when Egypt was first excavated professionally by Sir Flinders Petrie, he found plenty of evidence of the invasion, separate a battle, the separate graves after the battle of the of different types of people. Then there was the rock paintings or rock carvings of the invasion through the wadis from the Red Sea, and that was established, and everybody accepted this until 1945, end of the Second World War, the end of colonialism, and the fashion was to stress the indigenous origin of the newly independent and soon to be independent countries, one of which was Egypt. And so Egyptologists who kind of study Egypt as the only thing that matters to them, kind of hone down and say, yeah, we don't need to look elsewhere. It's only Egypt. Egypt had indigenous origins. And that was the case until the last 20 or 30 years, I suppose, maybe 40 years. And there began to be a pushback. And now there seems to be, again, overwhelming evidence that there was this invasion from Uruk, as you say, a Mesopotamian, very powerful city-state in Mesopotamia. The conventional date for this is 3000 BC or thereabouts. We'll come back to the conventional and what I think is the mistaken conventional dates. Now, this is an extraordinary thing. You know, this isn't one land empire pinching a few miles of territory from an adjacent empire. This is a military expedition which is sailing south through the Persian Gulf, around Saudi Arabia, up the Red Sea, and invading through the wadis of eastern Egypt. It's an extraordinary thing. Not only that, but it was coordinated with what we now call Phoenicians, who invaded possibly the same way, but it could have been from the land, because at the same time they took over 3 or 4 ports on the Levant coast, Eastern Mediterranean, but also Buto, which is in the Nile Delta. And according to biblical accounts, Libya and Punt, which is south of Egypt. So why, you have to ask yourself, would they go to this huge logistical effort to invade Egypt? And the only reason that I can come up with, which is credible, and nobody else has come up with any other ideas, is gold. They'd seen how Indians loved precious metals, especially gold, and still do, and they knew that the main source of gold in the ancient world was Egypt, and actually south of Egypt, Nubia. And so in order to pay for all this stuff from India that they needed a lot more gold. This seems to me to be the most obvious explanation as to why they did it. Now, if you think it's a stretch, it's not really. When you think about later history, the Roman Empire traded with India from Egypt, and what did the Indians want then? They wanted gold, and the emperors grumbled about it. It was draining the Roman Empire of gold, but it was so massively profitable for the traders, but also the tax on the imports of Indian produce into the Roman Empire. So valuable was it that they couldn't stop it. And then we get to Vasco da Gama, and he sails up into Calicut with his baubles and trinkets and useless rubbish, and the Samudra of Calicut laughs at him. And he said, no. If you want to come back, this is what we want. And he lists it on the top one of the list, gold. And then the East India Company in the 17th century, they want to trade with India naturally. And what do they have to to give to the Indians in order to get what they want? Gold. So it's not really a stretch to say that this was the reason at this time. There's no direct proof. There's no smoking gun. There's no tablet which explains it. But it seems to me this, if you join the dots, this is the obvious explanation.
So you have also covered two prominent ancient ports in India. One is the port of Dwarka and the later one is the Lothal. So can you give insights into them one by one?
Yeah, in 2012, an ancient port in the Gulf of Cambay, which I referred to earlier, was found, and by sonar mapping, the Gulf of Cambay is tricky to dive down. It's a lot of muddy water with rivers flowing into it, and they haven't even been able to get a semi-submersible down there to take pictures. It's just too difficult. So the sonar mapping is the only way they've been able to do it. The maps are very clear. You've got a citadel in the middle of the town, and with the settlement around it, and you've got even an ancient dockyard. And in fact, there are two ports. So one was obviously drowned, and then they built another one further inland, and that was drowned. And so the successor was a group of ports, but Lothal seems to be the main one. So this is and what is key about these ports are that they are the entrance and exit to the Indus-Saraswati lands, which provide the produce for the exports to Mesopotamia and the imports of probably metals, mainly from Mesopotamia into India. And so this infers that this trade goes back a long way. They wouldn't have built a sophisticated port with docks for fun. It was obviously for some use and some considerable use in volumes. So that's it. It's just the retreating coast that made these ports, and we think that drowned port is a legendary Dvaraka. I mean, again, I can't think of any other reason why it should be anything else, because Dvaraka is lauded in the ancient literature. So, and including reports of it being drowned in a single day.
So, sir, can we say that strongly that Indus-Saraswati civilization was a maritime society?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, for all the reasons I've just explained, and throughout history, maritime countries are inventive and they are artistic, and from a culture of invention by necessity, and it becomes the culture of invention per se, and people have got time, and it becomes rich, and people have got time on their hands to write literature and document knowledge gathering, and yeah, definitely, and the same happened in Tamil lands with the Sangam literature. And these are the most ancient and the most lengthy ancient literature. So, yeah, I think it ticks all the boxes.
You have also mentioned in your book that Jainism, or how Phoenician merchants came into contact with the philosophy of Jainism during their stay in India, and just how Jain ideas influenced the Hindus abandon animal and human sacrifice, but also influenced other civilizations and religions to do so, even as far as Greece. Like, how could you brief it to our viewers about this
Okay, how
theory?
did that happen? Well, Phoenicians, which who had come with Egypt in the first with the invasion of Egypt to get the gold. And Phoenicians, unlike Egyptians, who had this strong pharaonic civilization, which gloried in the pharaoh. He's son of God and all that kind of stuff. The Phoenicians weren't like that at all. They were strongly commercial. Were always strongly commercial, and it was as far as we can see through their intervention that the gold came out of Egypt and through Mesopotamia, and at each point, as we got closer to India, the price goes up. In Egypt, silver was more valuable, but as you get closer to India, it goes up. Whether the gold came down through the Red Sea or not, I think it's a possibility, but there's no evidence for it. But through Mesopotamia, certainly. But the Phoenicians did establish bases on the Red Sea coast of Egypt, and they did sail to India. And so who were they interacting with? Well, most of the merchants at this point, and we're talking now, let's say around 1000 BC, most of the merchants at this time on India's west coast were Jains, as far as I've been able to establish in Indian history. And so they were interacting with them. Now, because of the monsoon, they would have had to have stayed in India at least for 6 months of the year before the monsoon changed and they could sail back. So it stands to reason they would have absorbed some Indian ideas. Now, we're talking here about the time of the Trojan War. Now, I said the redating of Mediterranean Bronze Age. The Trojan War in conventional history is at 1188 or 1177 BC. And then it's followed by a 300-year Dark Age. And then it all pops back to life again. Well, Egyptologists may be happy with this, but an increasing number of other historians, including myself, are not happy. And so, cut a long story short, various historians have dated the Trojan War now anything between 870 BC and 950 BC. Not because I'm sitting on the fence, but I think it's more around 900 BC, give or take a couple of decades. But and I detail all this in great detail in the book. Now, you may remember if you read Homer that Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter before the Trojan War in order for the gods to give him winds to get to Troy.
Yeah.
And the Greeks were, anyway, they were sacrificing bulls in their hundreds, if not thousands. And by 600 BC, you don't see any human sacrifice, and you see almost no sacrifice of animals. So why did that happen? But not only that, that's in Greece. But not only that, we've got the same situation in the Middle East with the Phoenicians and the Hebrews, Jews. Mm. So what happened? Well, about the time of the Trojan War, it was also the breakdown of the Hittite Empire and the Egyptian Empire. And so the Phoenicians could no longer use the coast of Egypt for their voyages to India. So in the hiatus of all this this breakdown of Eastern Mediterranean civilization at this time, there is created the kingdom of Israel, and its second king is Solomon. And Hiram of Tyre, who is king of Tyre, one of the Phoenician ports, the biggest and most prosperous at that time, did a deal with Solomon. It's detailed in the Bible, in Ezekiel and Isaiah, and the terms of the trade was that if Hiram can use his Red Sea port in the Gulf of Aqaba, then they would be a joint venture and use the maritime expertise and the commercial expertise of the Phoenicians. Obviously, as part of the crew, some Hebrews, up until this time, not commercially orientated at all. We think of Jews now as commercially orientated, intellectually orientated, but at that time they were hill tribes of no real significance in world history, and world economic history, certainly. But they went as crew with the Phoenician merchants, and as the Bible said, once every 3 years, and this lasted about 100 years. Now, what happened is that in this time, you get a cessation of just as Jains were persuading Hindus not to make their horse sacrifices and animal sacrifices. This must have impacted at the same time on these people that were sitting in India waiting for the monsoon winds to reverse for 6 months, and 5 months or 6 months anyway. So this must have had an effect, and indeed, what we see is a gradual transition of the Hebrews from many gods into one god, and you find, I think, certainly some echoes of the Upanishads in the way that this happened, and the spirituality of one god, of one supreme god. You even get in towards the Roman period, you even get whole chunks of the Bhagavad Gita transposed, Lord of Lords, and all into the Bible. So this happened at a very early stage, and I think this was another pulse of Indian influence, much later than the ones we've just been talking about, that influenced how Phoenician, Hebrew society, and even Greek society, because the Phoenicians were adjacent to the Greeks, and so they had a coming together, a commercial interaction very early. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Now coming to bits of Sangam literature and the south of India. In Sangam literature, there is a mention of long lost islands like the Kumari Kandam and Puhar, and many further down south below Tamil Nadu, which are submerged today. While the dominant narrative in history today discard them as myths, stating the lack of archaeological evidence, you have explicitly mentioned in your research that these lands existed. So, did this place has acted as important trading ports and the cradle of ancient Indian civilizations?
Because of the floods, there must have been land south of there, and India connected to Sri Lanka, and as far as the Maldives, whether interconnected or very closely connected, it seems to me obvious. And again, we've just had this very recent discovery of Pumphahar with a port there, and so I mean, it's to me, it's obvious, it's indisputable. Nobody, at least directly face to face to me, has argued against it, and we haven't been able to have a conversation about that. It's because I don't want to boast, but I don't think anybody has really studied a history of maritime trade and the interconnectivity as a single subject. People have written about sea and navies because that's glamorous. There's lots of fighting, but nobody has concentrated on maritime trade as I have done. So, yeah, if I can open up this and give it some credibility, it's great.
Sir, you have mentioned that the word Arya, when we talk about the Vedic civilization, the word Arya was used as enlightenment and thus used as unenlightenment, completely detaching it from the racial aspect. So, how would you like to explain it when it comes to the Vedic civilization?
This is the racial aspect is a 19th century invention.
Yeah.
And a late 19th century invention. Actually, the early Indologists, the British that came in the 1780s and 1790s, were hugely impressed by India and its civilization. And it was only in the mid 19th century that evangelical Christianity seemed to pervade Victorian society. That it downplayed the role of India, and as part of that, the Aryan invasion theory was was the culmination of this. If you downplay India, well, it must have come. This great civilization must have come from somewhere else, and it was us. It was us Caucasians. Well, where in Eurasia? Nobody's ever been able to find it, and so I think most people, most sensible people, have kind of discarded the Aryan invasion theory. Although I'm surprised, I see on Twitter occasionally some people still arguing for it and saying that. The genetics prove that there was an alien invasion theory, but it doesn't. And you've got to be very careful of these genetic studies. They often try to prove what they believe, and they cherry pick the data. And you've got to put it in context with other data, archaeology, mythology, whatever. But other academic disciplines. And so, yeah, I mean, there was a migration, as I say, out of India and not into India. And I've been more explicit in my book. I try to detail it in linguistic areas. So the first out of India migration was at the end of the Ice Age, as the lands to the north became more hospitable, and they were warm and fertile and uninhabited. And so you get the migration through Asia by land, not by sea, into eventually Eastern Europe and Germany and the Slavs. And then the second lot came and stayed for a while in Anatolia, and then around 9000 BC started migrating by sea across the Mediterranean, with landfalls in Italy, southern France, Spain, Portugal, and then up the coast. And these, and until they reached Gibraltar, say, the linguists call this language route Italo-Celtic. Italo being the origin of Romance languages, which when they came up from the south, and Celtic from when they migrated up from Iberia through to Brittany and through to the British Isles. And these were the Celtic languages. And, actually, linguists do admit that there are similarities between Celtic languages and Romance languages. So, for instance, in French and Welsh, bridge is pont and punt, and Bont. So Pont and Bont. And window is fenestra and fenetra. So, and I've got plenty of other examples. So this is, but all this, and of course, once the Celts had got to Ireland, they made their way to the centre, and they found two breast-like hills, which they called the Paps of Danu, the Indian god. So they still carried that idea, even though it probably took 1,000 years or something. So yeah, I mean, again, Indian influence is absolutely key in this early stage of early Europe.
But there are also similarities between the Rig Veda and the ancient text of Avesta, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Also talking about Rig Veda, sir, you have mentioned that it was completed before 4500 BC, drawing info as far as 7000 BC. But in the present academia, or especially in India, if I'm to talk about, the Rig Veda is dated to 1500 BC. How can you explain this vast difference?
When Max Müller translated the Rig Veda in the 1860s, I think it was, he put 1500, and it was a pure guess. Now, later in his life, he admitted it was a pure guess. He didn't know. And I think his quote was something like, whether it's 1500 or 15,000, they stand alone and are very important. But other historians just didn't listen to that. They took the 1500 and cemented it as fact. And it's not fact. It was, as he admitted, it was a guess. And he was pioneering. So of course he's allowed to make mistakes. But the fact that it's become ingrained as fact is basically pretty criminal for the academics that still support that.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know. My expertise is in maritime trade, and that's what I've been doing for most of my life, and since retirement now as a maritime historian. So I don't claim to know much as Indians do about your culture and your history, but the most credible authors that have pushed against this, people like Subhash Kak and David Frawley, I get these dates from them, I think, and they know far more than me about this, but they seem absolutely credible to me. So I'm happy to read and say that makes total sense. Yep, I'm happy to go with that.
You also call the site of Mehrgarh in India being culturally Vedic. How so it is like a Neolithic site after all, because
Well, again, academics like to put artificial dates with saying this is this period and that is that period, and it doesn't work like that. And what I think is impressive about Indian history is that it's pretty uninterrupted. Um, an archaeologist that I quote in the book, Jim Schaefer, I think, says that that particular type of pottery goes back uninterrupted to about 8,000 or 9,000 BC. I think one of the first books I read on India was one that compared the wall paintings in Bhimbetka caves in northern India to the Shiva figure that he saw in festivals that he witnessed. So and those figures date, although those caves apparently date to 30,000 BC or something.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I don't think we can. I don't think that this idea of history in boxes, it's helpful sometimes, medieval to modern and pre-modern and ancient, but we shouldn't be religiously defined by that.
Yeah.
So I think there's enough continuity between those finds at that place and later history to say, yeah, it's continuous, and whether you want to call it Vedic or something else, it's the continuity is what impressed me, I think.
Sir, how much was the maritime connectivity between ancient India and ancient Africa?
That's a good question. There's no evidence that Africans were maritime orientated at this time, but I think there's only one bit of archaeological evidence that Queen Thuabi in Mesopotamia, dated I think to somewhere around 2400 BC. In her grave, there was copal, which can only be found in East Africa. And so, who brought it there? Well, as we've already discussed, it couldn't have been the Africans. It couldn't have been Mesopotamians. It could only have been the Indians. So the Indians of northwest India, why wouldn't they have gone to East Africa as well? But whether there was a significant trade there, there's no evidence for it, you know.
Sir, my very last question to you, and my personal favorite it is, were Indus-Saraswati and Vedic civilizations one and the same, or did one follow the another?
Um, I don't see any reason why we can't say that again, there's this history in boxes. Why aren't they the same? I think they're the same. If you look at my argument throughout the 3 volumes, that you find maritime civilizations, the spawn invention and literature and wealth creation, and that is true of the Indus-Saraswati. It's true of the Dutch in the 16th and 17th century. It's true of the British, 17th to 20th century. It's true of the Phoenicians in the first millennium BC, and it's true of all civilizations. When you forget the sea and you forget trade and you don't put it at the top of the agenda, you decline. Hence, the Dutch declined in the 18th century, the British in the 20th, and when India forgot about putting it at the top of their agenda just after the Second World War, it flatlined until the 1990s, when it began to liberalize the economy. And now I see that Sanjeev Sanyal is advising the PM, and you've got a flurry of maritime announcements in 2025
Yeah.
with the Nicobar project, and he's sailing this boat to Oman at the moment, the Kautinia, isn't it? And Cochin Shipyard got its first foreign order this year for small container ships. So yeah, India's on the move again, rediscovering its maritime past. I'd like Britain to do the same, but there we go.
Yes, sir, we are definitely on the rediscovering our maritime past. And about that, we have like India's maritime trade with Southeast Asia is documented to some extent, but not much focus is made on the Western India. Why so?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I spend more time in my book explaining the maritime trade with Mesopotamia and the crucial role of the Phoenicians.
Yeah.
I suspect that, it's archaeological discoveries that have yet to be made in in Indian subcontinent and in Southeast Asia. But yeah, you've only got you've got a lot of Hindu kingdoms coming up in the first millennium AD in Southeast Asia. Indianized kingdoms, I think, is the term in inverted commas.
Yeah.
But the speed of transition seems to me to be suspicious and probably there's a lot of undocumented or unrecorded previous contact of probably Tamil traders going or East Coast Indian traders going east. I mean, there's a lot of Indian archaeology is under the present settlements, and it's understandably difficult to dig it up when people are living there. So, but that must be an interesting route in the future to try and rediscover what happened and whether it was as late as the first millennium BC or perhaps earlier.
As you said, there is a lot of space for rediscovery about ancient Indian maritime trade. And I think this was just the beginning. And this conversation has taken us across oceans, continents, and millennia, and offering us a very refreshing and deeply engaging perspective on ancient Indian maritime networks. Sir, as I come to the end of this conversation, would you like to add anything about maritime trade in specific or India?
Yeah, I just would like to say one thing. I alluded to it at the beginning, and I meant to bring it up again, so I'll bring it up now. There's the Mediterranean chronology is a Bronze Age chronology, puts the Trojan War at 1188, where I think it's about 900. But this is important not only for this period, the whole of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, right back to the beginning of the Bronze Age. So the invasion from Uruk of Egypt, supposedly 3000, really comes back down to 2750 BC. Now, if we're wrong in these Mediterranean Bronze Age dates, this has implications for dating in Mesopotamia. And because a lot of Mesopotamian dates are based on Egyptian dates. And Indian history at this point is datable by radiocarbon dating, which is more or less accurate. Great strides have been made in the last 15 years on the accuracy of radiocarbon dating. It's not accurate to within one year, but anyway, it's not bad. And then there's dendrochronology, but a lot of it is datable by reference to Mesopotamian dates. So if those Mesopotamian dates are wrong, it's no wonder that at least I find the first millennium history of India confusing and confused. So a lot of Indian historians might want to come and help some of the revisionists on the Mediterranean to make more sense of their history of the first millennium BC. But yeah, that's other than that, I think you covered a lot of what I wanted to say, and the details are, of course, in my book, in my first book.